Hello students, welcome to the lecture on consumer equilibrium price, and after this lecture we will be able to learn the following objectives. Understand the concept of utility, explain the law of diminishing marginal utility, discuss consumer preferences, discuss the determination of consumer equilibrium. Let us start with what is consumer behavior. The behavior of the consumer, where the one decides with regards to select, purchase and then consumption of goods as well as services for the satisfaction of their needs and want, is known as consumer behavior. What is equilibrium price? There is only one price at which the preferences of sellers and buyers meet together. At that point, the quantity demanded of a commodity by the buyer is equivalent to the quantity the seller is willing to sell. This price is called as the equilibrium price, and it occurs at the point of intersection of the supply curve and the demand curve. In other words, equilibrium refers to a particular pair of prices and quantity. The supply and the demand will be in balance in equilibrium. Utility. Now we will move further to know about utility. What is utility? Utility is defined as the power of a commodity or a service to satisfy a human want. Utility is a subjective or psychological concept. The same commodity or service gives different utilities to different people. For example, think that utility is human need. Utility can be measured or expressed in units of wealth. Suppose A is hungry and that he needs 5 apples to satisfy his anger. The utility is 5 apples. Total utility. Total utility is the cumulative degree of satisfaction that a consumer receives through consumption of a specified product. Since this type of utility is all-encompassing, it includes both the initial and direct satisfaction the consumer enjoys, as well as the marginal utility and additional satisfaction that is realized from the purchase. Understanding total utility involves understanding what is sometimes known as the law of diminishing marginal utility. For example, an individual who is very thirsty may receive immense satisfaction from drinking a glass of water. A second glass of water is still likely to generate some satisfaction, but not as much as the first glass. At some point, the individual is no longer thirsty and thus does not receive any additional satisfaction from subsequent glasses of water. This example shows that marginal utility keeps on decreasing with the increase in the number of units consumed. Marginal utility. Marginal utility is the addition made to the total utility by consuming one more unit of a commodity. Marginal utility is an economic term that is used to describe the additional amount of satisfaction that is achieved from utilizing more than a single unit of a good or service. The idea is that as more units are consumed, the user does realize some additional type of satisfaction or utility from each subsequent use. A classic example of how marginal utility works involves considering the consumption of a glass of water. Assuming the consumer is thirsty, there is normally a great deal of satisfaction obtained by drinking the water contained in the glass. He or she is still likely to obtain some satisfaction from the consumption of second glass of water, but probably not as much as with the first glass. The satisfaction obtained from that second glass of water is additional or marginal utility. Law of diminishing marginal utility. After understanding utility, it will be easy for you to understand the law of diminishing marginal utility. This law states that as the amount consumed of a commodity increases, the utility derived by the consumer from the additional units, that is marginal utility, goes on decreasing. If a consumer takes more and more units of a commodity, the additional utility he derives from an extra unit of the commodity goes on falling. Thus, according to this law, the marginal utility decreases with the increase in the consumption of a commodity. When marginal utility decreases, the total utility increases at a diminishing rate. There are certain assumptions of this law, such as the units of consumption must be in standard units. Example, a cup of tea, a bottle of cool drink, etc. All the units of the commodity must be identical in all aspects, like taste, quality, color, and size. The law holds good only when the process of consumption continues without any time gap. The consumer's taste, habit, or preference must remain the same during the process of consumption. The income of the consumer remains constant. The prices of the commodity consumed and its substitutes are constant. The consumer is assumed to be a rational economic man. As a rational consumer, he wants to maximize the total utility. Utility is measurable. Total utility and marginal utility are interrelated to each other. Relationship between total utility and marginal utility can be explained as follows. Here, from the MU curve, we can see that MU is declining as consumer consumes more of the commodity. When TU is maximum, MU is 0. After that, TU starts declining and MU becomes negative. Studying this law is very important for understanding basic economics. Importance of law of diminishing marginal utility. The law of diminishing marginal utility, DMU, is the foundation for various other economic laws. For example, the law of demand is the result of the operation of the law of diminishing marginal utility. In other words, as more and more units of a commodity are consumed, each of them gives less and less marginal utility. This is due to the operation of the law of DMU. As utility falls, consumer is therefore willing to pay a lower price only. The law of DMU operates in the case of money also. A rich man already possesses a lot of money. If more and more money is newly added to his income, marginal utility of money begins to fall. This law is a handy tool for the finance minister for increasing tax rate on the rich. Producers are guided by the operation, the law of DMU unconsciously. They constantly change the design, the package of their goods so that the goods become more attractive to the consumers and they appear as new goods. Apart from advantages, this law is also having some criticism, which is as follows. The law of DMU is criticized on the following grounds. Deriving utility is a psychological experience when we say a unit of X gives 10 units of utility. This means that utility can be measured precisely. In reality, utility cannot be measured. For example, when a person sees a film and says it is very good, we cannot measure the utility he has derived from it. However, we can measure utility indirectly by the cinema fare he is willing to pay. The law is based on a single commodity consumption mode. That is, a consumer consumes only one good at a time. This is an unrealistic assumption. In real life, a consumer consumes more than one good at a time. According to the law, a consumer should consume successive units of the same good continuously. In real life, it is not so. The law assumes constancy of the marginal utility of money. This means the marginal utility of money remains constant even when money stock changes. In real life, the marginal utility derived from the consumption of a good cannot be measured precisely in monetary terms. As utility itself is capable of varying from person to person, marginal utility derived from the consumption of a good cannot be measured precisely. consumer preferences. I hope you understood this concept that I just explained. Now we will move further and study consumer preferences. The underlying foundation of demand, therefore, is a model of how consumers behave. The individual consumer has a set of preferences and values whose determinations are outside the realm of economics. To make it more clear, we need to know about some concepts which are as follows.
In India, consumers generally face a number of problems. They include non-availability of goods, adulteration, hoarding, black marketing, deceptive and misleading selling techniques, and false warranties or guarantees, etc. Today, we are going to study the factors leading to consumer exploitation. At first, we will come to know about different factors leading to consumer exploitation. Point 1. High prices. Sometimes, artificial shortage of commodities is created in the market. The producers and suppliers do not release enough supplies of goods in the market. Consumers are forced to buy the commodities at a high price. Point 2. Poor quality of goods. There is a general feeling that in India, the quality of goods or services has been declining. Manufacturers, in expectation of greater profit, increase production but neglect the quality aspect of production. Many reputed firms have their own quality control departments, but the number of such firms is very limited. The quality of the products can be deteriorated due to impure or poisoned material used in production. Such adulteration is very dangerous to health. Like, if we drink poisoned milk in the morning, then what will happen? We will fall sick.
The theory of the consumer. Consumer makes decisions by allocating their scarce income across all possible goods in order to obtain the greatest satisfaction. Formally, we say that consumers maximize their utility subject to budget constraint. Utility is defined as the satisfaction that a consumer derives from the consumption of a good. As noted above, utility's determinants are decided by a host of non-economic factors. Consumer value is measured in terms of the relative utilities between goods. These reflect the consumer's preferences. Theory of consumer preferences. Consumer preferences are defined as the subjective, individual tastes as measured by utility of various bundles of goods. They permit the consumer to rank these bundles of goods according to the levels of utility they give the consumer, commodity bundles. The goal of the theory of preferences is for the consumer to be able to rank these commodity bundles according to the amount of utility obtained from them. In other words, the consumer has different preferences over the different combinations of goods defined by the set of commodity bundles. In order to develop a model, we need to make some assumptions about the consumer's preferences. There are 4 assumptions. The first is decisiveness. Here, given any 2 commodity bundles in commodity space, the consumer must be able to rank them. In following, suppose we randomly choose 2 commodity bundles A and B. This assumption means that the consumer must be able to say that they prefer commodity bundle A over B or B over A, or that bundles A and B provide the same level of utility. The second assumption is consistency. The consumer must be consistent in preference and rankings. Again, referring, suppose now include bundle C. Let the consumer prefer commodity bundle A over B and also commodity bundle B over C. Then by this assumption, the consumer must prefer A over C. The third assumption is non-satiation. In other words, more is always better than less. More formally, any commodity bundle with at least as much of one good and more of the other must be preferred. The last of the assumptions is convexity, which is the most difficult to explain. It is based on the notion that as a consumer consumes more and more of a particular good, the additional utility obtained decreases. We define marginal utility as the change in utility due to an incremental increase in the consumption of a given good. Convexity says that marginal utility declines as consumption increases. What is an indifference curve? An indifference curve is a collection of all commodity bundles which provide the consumer with the same level of utility. The indifference curve is so named because the consumer would be indifferent between choosing any one of these commodity bundles. After discussing the above topics, one must think that why indifference curves are negatively sloped. Indifference curves cannot be upward sloping because the consumer cannot be indifferent between two commodity bundles if one has more of both goods. Marginal rate of substitution, MRS. Now we will move further and study marginal rate of substitution, MRS. As we move along an indifference curve from left to right, the consumer is consuming more and more of good X and less of good Y. Thus, the marginal utility of the additional unit of good X declines, whereas the marginal utility of the foregone Y increases. Since by indifference curve's definition that each commodity bundles provide the same level of utility, the consumer is willing to give up less and less good Y as he or she consumes more and more good X in order to hold utility constant. This trade-off between goods X and Y along an indifference curve is an important matter. It is called the marginal rate of substitution, MRS. The marginal rate of substitution reflects the maximum amount of good Y the consumer would be willing to give up in order to obtain an additional unit of X. The slope of an indifference curve, the MRS, reflects the value placed on the additional unit of a good in terms of the other goods the consumer would be willing to give up. I is equal to Px into X plus Py into Y. In this equation, the consumer has expended all income I across both goods X and Y, where Px and Py are the prices of X and Y respectively. The equation can be written as Y is equal to I upon Py minus Px upon Py into X. Its slope is Px upon Py and the y-intercept is I upon Py. The budget line divides commodity space into two. The commodity bundles which are affordable are shown as being on or below the line. Income is completely spent for those bundles on the line. We exclude the commodity bundles below the budget line since all income is not being spent. The commodity bundles above and to the right of the budget line are beyond the reach of the consumer given their income and the prices of goods X and Y. Consumer equilibrium.
What are these surpluses? Please explain.
The concepts of consumer surplus and producer surplus help us to measure the benefit the buyers and suppliers derive in a competitive market from a product. Let's first start with a consumer surplus. Consumer surplus, the amount that buyers are willing to pay for a good minus the amount they actually pay for it. It measures how much the buyer values the good or service. The market demand curve depicts the various quantities that buyers would be willing and be able to purchase at different prices. The area below the demand curve and above the equilibrium price measures the consumer surplus in the market.
Not clear. Can you please explain through a practical example?
Sure. Let's start from buyer's willingness to pay. Willingness to pay price is the maximum that a buyer will pay to buy a product. In other words, he will not buy any fan if the price is even slightly higher. At that price, he may like to purchase only one fan. He will be happier if the prices are lower than his maximum price, that is, his willingness to pay price. Consider the table fans market. Listed above is the amount that 4 individuals, Jack, Paul, Gray, and Robert in the town are willing to pay for fans. Let's assume $100 is Jack's willingness to pay. $80 is Paul's willingness to pay. $60 is Gray's willingness to pay. And $40 is Robert's willingness to pay. For a price more than $100, none of the buyers are ready to buy, as this price is much higher than willingness to pay of any of the buyer, as a result of which quantity demanded is 0. For the price range between $80 to $100, only Jack is ready to buy and the quantity demanded is 1. For the price range between $60 to $80, both Jack and Paul are ready to buy and the quantity demanded is 2. For the price range between $40 to $60, Jack, Paul, and Gray are ready to buy and the quantity demanded is 3. For the price less than $40, all the buyers, Jack, Paul, Gray, and Robert are ready to buy and the quantity demanded is 4. Let's now measure the consumer surplus at each price point of demand curve. In the above graph, we can see that at the price point of $80, the consumer surplus for Jack is $20. That is, willingness to pay price minus actual price, which is 100 minus 80, results in $20. As the prices decrease, the consumer surplus increases because of the greater perceived value to the existing customers and also because of addition of new customers whose threshold is now above the...
Let us move further. Do you know what is consumer equilibrium? When consumers make choices about the quantity of goods and services to maximize his total utility. Consumers' income and the prices of the goods and services are the two constraints in maximizing total utility. The solution to the consumer's problem, which entails decisions about how much the consumer will consume of a number of goods and services, is referred to as consumer equilibrium. The next question that arises is how to determine consumer equilibrium. Consider the simple case of a consumer who cares about consuming only 2 goods, good 1 and good 2. Prices of good 1 and good 2 are fixed. Also, the income is fixed. The consumer will purchase quantities of goods 1 and 2 so as to completely exhaust the budget for such purchases. The actual quantities purchased of each good are determined by the condition for consumer equilibrium, which is marginal utility of good 1, marginal utility of good 2 is equal to price of good 1, price of good 2. This condition states that the marginal utility per dollar spent on good 1 must equal the marginal utility per dollar spent on good 2. If marginal utility of good 1 is more than good 2, then consumer will buy more of good 1. After purchasing more and more of good 1, the marginal utility of good 1 will eventually fall due to the law of diminishing marginal utility, so that the marginal utility per dollar spent on good 1 will eventually equal that of good 2. This concept will become clearer after this example. In this example, we take the budget of the consumer equal to $5. The marginal utility per dollar spent on the first unit of good 1 is greater than the marginal utility per dollar spent on the first unit of good 2. 12 utile is greater than 9 utile. Because the price of good 1 is $2 per unit, the consumer can afford to purchase this first unit of good 1, and so she does. She now has $5 minus $2 is equal to $3 remaining in her budget. The consumer's next step is to compare the marginal utility per dollar spent on the second unit of good 1 with marginal utility per dollar spent on the first unit of good 2. Because these ratios are both equal to 9 utile, the consumer is indifferent between purchasing the second unit of good 1 and first unit of good 2. So she purchases both. She can afford to do so because the second unit of good 1 costs $2 and the first unit of good 2 costs $1 for a total of $3. At this point, the consumer has exhausted her budget of $5 and has arrived at the consumer equilibrium where the marginal utilities per dollar spent are equal. The consumer's equilibrium choice is to purchase 2 units of good 1 and 1 unit of good 2. The condition for consumer equilibrium can be extended to the more realistic case where the consumer must choose how much to consume of many different goods. When there are n is greater than 2 goods to choose from, the consumer equilibrium condition is to equate all of the marginal utilities per dollar spent is equal to marginal utility of good 1, marginal utility of good 2, marginal utility of good n is equal to price of good 1, price of good 2, price of good n. Summary. Now in the end, let us summarize what we have learnt in this lecture. Equilibrium is attained at a point where market demand is equal to market supply. Utility is the want satisfying power of a commodity. Law of marginal utility states that as the amount consumed of a commodity increases, the utility derived by the consumer from the additional units, that is marginal utility, goes on decreasing. Marginal rate of substitution is the amount of good 1 that consumer is willing to sacrifice in order to increase the consumption of good 2. Consumer attains equilibrium at the point of intersection of budget line and highest attainable indifference curve.